This is HOA busted. It started with a parking warning and ended with a tow truck ambush. I pulled into my driveway at 6 in the morning after a 12-hour shift at the water treatment plant, and a tow truck was already backing in behind me. Carol Carter stood on the curb with a clipboard in one hand and a stack of chalk sticks in the other like they were official tools, and she was yelling that my permit decal was tampered with. I got out of my car and said the decal was issued by the HOA office 2 days ago, and she cut me off and said the adhesive looked peeled, which meant I moved it from another vehicle. I said that is insane, and she said, "I decide what counts as compliant, not you." The tow driver climbed down from the cab and started unspooling the wheel lift chain, and I shouted at him to stop. He looked at Carol, and Carol nodded, and he kept walking toward my rear bumper. I live in Beacon Hill Commons Association in Erie, Pennsylvania, and the HOA has turned guest parking and permit enforcement into a full-time harassment campaign. I work nights as a water treatment plant operator on strict schedules, and I need predictable sleep, but Carol has been targeting me for 3 months. She is the social committee chair, but she acts like a compliance officer, and she has convinced the board that aggressive towing is the only way to keep the neighborhood clean. The rules say every vehicle needs a current permit decal on the windshield, and guest passes are only valid for 48 hours, and any violation can be towed on site. Carol has a stack of chalk sticks she treats like official tools, and she marks tires at random to prove vehicles have been parked too long, and she calls the tow vendor the second she thinks she has a case. She slapped a bright orange tow warning sticker on my driver's side window and said the decal was non-compliant, and I pulled out my phone to call the HOA office. She said the office does not open until 9, and by then my car would be in the tow yard, and I would owe the hook fee in the first day of storage. I said I have the receipt from the office in my glove box, and she said receipts do not prove the decal was not moved after issuance. The tow driver hooked the wheel lift under my rear axle and started cranking the hydraulic lever, and I stepped between him and the truck and told him he is about to tow a legally permitted vehicle. He said he has an authorization signed by the HOA, and if I want to dispute it, I need to call his boss after the tow is complete. Carol smiled and said, "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works." I kept my voice low, because my trump card needed perfect timing. I had a gate vendor service report proving the lockout was intentional configuration, not a glitch, and I was not going to blow it on a curb argument with Carol. My attorney said if I want an emergency stop I need one document today, and Carol was stalling on purpose. I took a breath and said I am not moving, and if he lifts my car with me standing here he is creating a safety hazard. The driver looked nervous, and Carol stepped closer and said I was threatening him, which I was not. She pulled out her phone and said she was calling the police for interference with HOA enforcement, and I said go ahead, because the police do not work for the HOA. The wind picked up and slammed my car door shut, and Carol flinched and then pretended she did not. 2 neighbors came out of their houses across the street and stood on their porches whispering and pointing at the chalk marks by my tires, and I realized Carol had marked my tires yesterday while I was at work. She does it to everyone, and then she claims the marks prove you parked in the same spot for more than 72 hours, which violates the emergency vehicle access rule even if you are in your own driveway. I said the chalk marks are not legal proof of anything, and she said the HOA attorney disagrees, and if I have a problem with the enforcement I can file a written complaint and wait for the next board meeting in 3 weeks. I said 3 weeks is too long, and she said that is not her problem. The driver finished hooking the lift and walked back to the cab, and I shouted that I am recording this, and he stopped. Carol said recording without consent is illegal, and I said we are on my property and I can record whatever I want. She looked at the driver and said ignore him, he is bluffing, and the driver said he is not paid enough to get arrested for a disputed tow. Carol said there is no dispute, the decal is tampered, and she has photographic evidence. I said, "Show me the photos," and she pulled a stack of printed photos clipped together with no readable text from her cardigan pocket and fanned them like playing cards. I could see my car in the photos, but the lighting was terrible and the angle made the decal look wrinkled when it is not. I said those photos are deliberately misleading, and she said the board reviewed them and agreed with her assessment. The driver said he needs a signature from Carol to proceed, and Carol signed the authorization form on his clipboard with color-coded sticky notes labeled by dates, and I saw her write today's date even though she took the photos yesterday. I said that is fraud, and she said the date reflects the enforcement action, not the violation discovery, and if I do not understand HOA procedures, that is my fault. I said I am calling my attorney, and she said go ahead, but the tow will be complete before any attorney answers the phone. The driver climbed into the cab, and I stood directly in front of the truck and said I am not moving until someone from the HOA office confirms this authorization in writing. Carol said I was trespassing on HOA common property, which made no sense because we were in my driveway, and I said the driveway is part of my lot. She said the HOA plat map shows the first 6 feet of every driveway as common property for utility access, and I was in violation of the anti-obstruction rule. I wanted to scream, but my mental health has been fragile and the harassment was pushing me to the edge, so I focused on breathing and keeping my voice steady. I moved to the side of the driveway and called my attorney, and he picked up on the second ring because I had warned him this was coming. He said, "Do not let them tow the car. Get the driver's name and company and tell Carol you are requesting an emergency meeting with the board president." I did exactly that, and Carol laughed and said the board president is her sister-in-law, and there will be no emergency meeting. I said that is a conflict of interest, and she said the HOA bylaws allow family members to serve together as long as they disclose it, which they did at the annual meeting 2 years ago. The driver started the engine, and the hydraulic lift whined, and my rear tires lifted 6 inches off the ground. I took photos of the truck, the license plate, the driver, and Carol standing there with her arms crossed, and Carol said I was violating her privacy. I said you are on my property enforcing a disputed action, and I have every right to document it. She said the HOA will add a harassment complaint to my file, and I said go ahead, because I am adding a fraud complaint to hers. The lift stopped, and the driver leaned out the window and said his boss just called, and told him to stand down until the HOA provides written authorization from the board president, not just the social committee chair. Carol's face went red, and she said she has full authority to authorize tows, and the driver said his boss does not care what she thinks, he wants a signature from the president or he is unhooking the car. Carol pulled out her phone and called someone, and I heard her say the driver is refusing to complete the tow, and she needs the president to send an email right now. She put the call on speaker, and a woman's voice said, "Carol, I am not signing off on a tow without seeing the photos first, and you know that." Carol said the photos are in the file, and the voice said I do not see them, and I am not authorizing anything until I do. Carol hung up and glared at me, and I said it sounds like you skipped a step. She said this is not over, and she told the driver to unhook the car. He lowered the lift, unhooked the chain and drove away, and Carol stood there for a moment staring at me like she was planning her next move. Then she turned and walked toward her house, and I went inside and collapsed on the couch. I thought that was the end of it, but 2 hours later I got a text from the HOA office saying my account was flagged for multiple violations, and I owed $300 in fines for improper decal display, obstruction of common property, and verbal abuse of a vendor. I called the office, and the assistant said the fines were entered by Carol this morning, and if I wanted to dispute them I needed to submit a written appeal within 10 business days. I said I already filed a complaint about Carol, and the assistant said complaints and appeals are separate processes, and I needed to pay the fines or my account would be sent to collections. I asked who approved the fines, and she said Carol has signature authority for violations under $500. I said that is insane, and she said it is in the bylaws, and if I do not like the rules I should run for the board. I hung up and called my attorney back, and he said we need to escalate this to a management audit, because Carol is clearly abusing her authority. He said the HOA is managed by a regional property management company, and they have a compliance division that investigates board members when there is a pattern of abuse. I said what counts as a pattern, and he said at least 3 documented incidents involving the same board member and the same type of violation. I already had the tow attempt, the fraudulent fines, and the conflict of interest with the board president, so I sent him everything I had, and he said he would draft a formal complaint to the management company. That night I went to work, and when I came home the next morning there was a bright orange cone in my driveway with a laminated notice zip-tied to it that said my driveway was under review for unauthorized modifications, and I was prohibited from parking there until the review was complete. I called the HOA office, and the assistant said Carol filed a report claiming I installed a new concrete pad without architectural approval, which was completely false. My driveway is original to the house, and I have never modified it. The assistant said the review process takes up to 30 days, and in the meantime I needed to park on the street. I said the street parking requires a separate permit, and she said I could apply for one, but the waiting list is 6 weeks. I moved the cone to the side of the driveway and parked anyway, and the next morning it was back in the center with a new notice saying I was in violation of the temporary prohibition and subject to immediate towing. I took photos of everything and sent them to my attorney, and he said this is retaliation, and we need to document every single action Carol takes. He said keep a log with dates, times, and descriptions, and save every email, text, and notice. I started a spreadsheet that night, and within a week I had 12 entries. Carol escalated again. She showed up at my door with 2 people I had never seen before, and she said they were HOA compliance witnesses, and they needed to inspect my driveway for the review. I said I do not consent to an inspection without written notice, and she said the bylaws allow inspections with 24 hours verbal notice, and she left a voicemail yesterday. I checked my phone and saw a voicemail from an unknown number that I had ignored because I get spam calls constantly. I said a voicemail from an unknown number does not count as proper notice, and she said it absolutely does, and if I refused entry she would note it in the report as obstruction. I said fine, inspect whatever you want, and I stood in the doorway with my phone recording while they walked around my driveway taking photos and measurements. One of the witnesses whispered something to Carol, and Carol smiled and said they found evidence of resurfacing in the northwest corner, and I would be receiving a violation notice. I said the driveway has not been resurfaced, and she said the color variation proves otherwise. I looked at the spot she was pointing at, and it was a patch where the previous owner repaired a crack 15 years ago, and it is clearly visible in the property photos from when I bought the house. I said I have proof that patch predates my ownership, and she said the HOA has a right to enforce current standards regardless of when the modification occurred. I said that is not how property law works, and she said the HOA attorney disagrees. They left, and I called my attorney, and he said we are past the point of informal resolution, and we need to force a formal hearing. He said the management company has to respond to my complaint within 15 business days, and if they find merit they will open an investigation. I said 15 days feels like forever, and he said I know, but we need to follow the process, because if we skip steps the HOA will use it against us. He also said I should start attending board meetings and asking questions on the record, because the board has to answer questions from homeowners, and their answers become part of the official minutes. The next board meeting was in 4 days, and I cleared my schedule. I had never been to a meeting before, because I work nights and they are always scheduled at 7 in the evening, but my attorney said this was important enough to lose sleep over. I showed up 10 minutes early, and the meeting was in the clubhouse conference room, and there were maybe 8 other homeowners there. Carol was sitting at the front table with the board president and 3 other board members, and she did not look at me when I walked in. I sat in the back row and opened my notebook, The meeting started with the usual business: budget reports, landscaping bids, pool maintenance schedules, and then they opened the floor for homeowner comments. I raised my hand, and the board president called on me, and I stood up and said I wanted to address the pattern of retaliatory enforcement actions taken by Carol Carter over the past 3 months. The room went silent, and Carol said that is not an appropriate topic for public comment, and the president said homeowners are allowed to raise concerns about board member conduct. I said I have documented 12 separate incidents of harassment, fraudulent fines, and abuse of process, and I would like the board to review the complaints I filed with the management company. Carol interrupted and said I was making false accusations, and the president told her to let me finish. I said the most recent incident involved an attempted tow of a legally permitted vehicle based on fabricated evidence, and I have photos, recordings, and witness statements. Carol said I was lying, and the president said, "Carol, please," and Carol said she has full authority to authorize tows, and the board gave her that authority 2 years ago. I said the bylaws require board president approval for any tow that costs more than $200, and the tow Carol authorized would have cost $450, including the hook fee and storage. Carol said the bylaws were amended last year, and I said I never received notice of any amendment, and neither did anyone else in this room based on the confused looks I am seeing. The president said she would check the amendment records, and Carol said there is no need. The amendment is valid. And I said if it is valid, then the board should have no problem producing a copy of the notice that was mailed to all homeowners. The president said she would look into it, and I said I also want to know why the board president is signing off on enforcement actions initiated by her sister-in-law without any third-party review. Carol stood up and said that is a personal attack, and I said it is a factual statement about a conflict of interest. Another homeowner in the front row said, "Wait, you two are related," and the president said yes, but it was disclosed 2 years ago, and the homeowner said I never saw any disclosure. The meeting fell apart after that. 3 other homeowners started asking questions about enforcement actions they had received, and Carol kept interrupting and saying everything was done by the book, and the president tried to regain control, but it was too late. Someone said they got fined for parking in their own driveway overnight, and someone else said they got towed from a guest spot even though they had a valid guest pass, and another person said Carol told them the guest pass was expired even though it was dated for that same week. I stayed quiet and let the room build momentum, because my attorney told me the best thing I could do was let other people share their stories so it did not look like a personal vendetta. The president finally said we are going to table this discussion and schedule a special meeting to review enforcement procedures. And Carol said that is unnecessary, and the president said, "Carol, we are tabling it." The meeting adjourned, and I stayed in my seat while everyone else filed out, and Carol walked past me and said, "This is not over." I said, "I know," and she left. 2 days later, I got a call from the management company compliance division, and they said they received my complaint and they were opening an investigation. They said they would need to interview me, Carol, the board president, and any witnesses I could provide, and the process would take approximately 3 weeks. I said 3 weeks is too long, and the investigators said they understand, but they have to follow their procedures. I asked what happens if they find evidence of abuse, and the investigators said the management company can recommend sanctions, removal from the board, or termination of the management contract if the board refuses to cooperate. I said that sounds good, and the investigators said do not get your hopes up. Most of these investigations end with a slap on the wrist. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe, because I have plenty more HOA nightmares to share. I went back to work and tried to keep my head down, but Carol was not done. She posted cropped screenshots in the neighborhood group chat, showing me yelling at the tow driver, and the crop made it look like I was threatening him, when in reality I was just telling him to stop. The group chat believed the crop, and I started getting nasty messages from neighbors saying I was making the neighborhood unsafe and I should move if I do not like the rules. I posted the full video in response, and half the group apologized, but the other half doubled down and said I was a troublemaker. Carol posted a follow-up message saying I had a history of verbal abuse toward vendors, which was completely false, and I replied with a screenshot of the compliance investigation notice, and Carol said the investigation was a waste of HOA resources and I should be billed for the cost. The special meeting was scheduled for the following week, and my attorney said we should bring the gate vendor service report, because that was the trump card that would prove Carol manipulated the system. The report showed that the gate system lockout that happened 2 months ago was not a glitch. It was an intentional configuration change made by someone with admin access, and the only people with admin access were the board president, the property manager, and Carol. The vendor flagged the change as unusual and sent a report to the management company, but the report was never forwarded to the board or the homeowners. My attorney got a copy through a public records request, because the HOA is required to keep vendor contracts and reports on file. I did not tell anyone I had the report, because I needed the perfect moment to deploy it. Carol had been claiming for weeks that the lockout was a system malfunction, and she used it as justification for installing new surveillance cameras at the gate, which cost the HOA $12,000. If I could prove the lockout was intentional, then the camera installation was based on a false premise, and the board would have grounds to reverse the expenditure and investigate who authorized the configuration change. The special meeting was packed. There were at least 30 homeowners in the room, and the board had to bring in extra chairs. The president opened the meeting and said they were going to review enforcement procedures and address concerns raised at the last meeting. Carol was sitting at the front table with a stack of binders in front of her, and she looked calm and prepared, which made me nervous. The president said they would start with public comment, and I raised my hand, but 3 other people raised their hands first, and the president called on them. The first homeowner said she got fined $300 for having a wreath on her door during the wrong season, and Carol said the fine was valid because the architectural guidelines prohibit seasonal decorations outside the designated holiday window. The homeowner said the guidelines do not define what counts as a holiday, and Carol said Christmas, Thanksgiving, and Independence Day are the only recognized holidays. The homeowner said, "What about Halloween?" And Carol said Halloween is not a recognized holiday. Another homeowner said that is ridiculous, and Carol said the guidelines are clear. The second homeowner said he got towed from a guest spot even though he had a valid guest pass, and Carol said the pass was expired. The homeowner said the pass was dated for that week, and Carol said the pass was issued for the wrong vehicle. The homeowner said he only has one vehicle, and Carol said the license plate on the pass did not match the plate on the vehicle. The homeowner pulled out his phone and showed a photo of the pass, and the plate matched, and Carol said the photo could be edited. The room erupted, and the president banged a gavel and said we need to stay civil. The third homeowner said Carol tried to tow her car while she was loading groceries, and Carol said the vehicle was parked in a fire lane. The homeowner said she was only there for 2 minutes, and Carol said the fire lane has a zero-tolerance policy. The homeowner said Carol did not call a tow truck. Carol physically stood behind the car and blocked her from leaving until she moved it, and Carol said that is not what happened. The homeowner said she has a video, and Carol said videos can be edited. I raised my hand again, and the president called on me, and I stood up and said I want to address the tow authorization process because it is being abused. Carol said I was out of order, and the president said let him speak. I said Carol authorized a tow of my vehicle based on fabricated evidence, and when the tow driver requested board president approval, Carol bypassed the requirement by claiming she has blanket authority. I said the bylaws require board president approval for any tow over $200, and Carol said the bylaws were amended. I said I am requesting a copy of the amendment, and the president said she already looked into it, and there is no record of an amendment. Carol's face went pale, and she said the amendment was passed at the annual meeting, and the president said we reviewed the minutes and there is no mention of it. Carol said the minutes must be incomplete, and I said, or you are lying. The president said that is not helpful, and I said I apologize, but I have been targeted by Carol for 3 months, and I am not the only one, and the board needs to take action. The president said they are taking it seriously, and they have asked the management company to conduct a full audit of Carol's enforcement actions. Carol stood up and said this is a witch hunt, and I am being attacked for doing my job. I said your job is to serve the community, not harass homeowners, and Carol said I decide what counts as compliant, not you. The room went silent, and I smiled, because she just said it again on the record. I pulled out my folder and said I have evidence that Carol has been manipulating HOA systems to create enforcement opportunities, and I would like to present it now. The president said go ahead, and I walked to the front of the room and handed her the Gate Vendor Service Report. The president read the first page, and her face changed, and she looked at Carol and said, "Is this true?" Carol said she does not know what that document is, and I said it is a service report from the gate vendor showing that the lockout 2 months ago was an intentional configuration change, not a malfunction. The president said who authorized the change, and I said the report lists 3 people with admin access: the board president, the property manager, and Carol. The president said I did not authorize it, and I said then it was either the property manager or Carol. The property manager was sitting in the back of the room, and she stood up and said I did not touch the gate system, I do not even have the login credentials anymore. I asked Carol to take over gate management 6 months ago, because she said she wanted to streamline access control. The room turned and stared at Carol, and Carol said that is not true, and the property manager said I have the email where you requested admin access. Carol said the email does not prove anything, and I said the vendor report proves everything, because it includes a timestamp and a user ID, and the user ID matches Carol's HOA email address. The president said, "Carol, did you lock the gate on purpose?" And Carol said, "I did not lock it. I adjusted the access schedule to prevent unauthorized entry, and the system glitched." I said the vendor report says the system did not glitch. It executed the configuration exactly as entered, and the configuration you entered locked out every homeowner except board members for 3 hours. The president said, "Why would you do that?" And Carol said I was testing a new security protocol, and I was going to explain it at the next meeting. I said you installed $12,000 worth of cameras based on a fake malfunction, and Carol said the cameras were necessary regardless of the lockout. Another homeowner shouted that Carol should resign, and someone else said she should be removed from the board, and the president banged the gavel and said we will handle this through proper channels. She said the management company is already investigating, and this report will be added to their file. Carol said the investigation is biased, and the president said, "Carol, you are not helping yourself." Carol grabbed her binders and walked out of the room, and the meeting continued without her. The president said they would vote on a motion to suspend Carol's enforcement authority pending the outcome of the investigation, and the motion passed unanimously. She also said they would vote on a motion to reverse the camera expenditure and seek reimbursement from the vendor, and that motion passed as well. I sat down and felt the weight lift off my chest for the first time in weeks, but I knew this was not over, because Carol does not give up easily. 2 days later, Carol showed up at my house with 2 people I did not recognize, and she said they were witnesses, and she was serving me with a trespass notice for entering HOA common property without authorization. I said I live here, and she said I violated the temporary driveway prohibition, and the HOA is exercising its right to restrict my access to common property. I said my driveway is not common property, and she said the first 6 feet is, and I parked there in violation of the restriction. I said the restriction was based on a fraudulent inspection, and she said the inspection was valid and I am in violation. I called my attorney on speaker, and he told Carol that if she does not leave my property immediately, he will file for a restraining order. Carol said she is not on my property, she is on HOA common property, and my attorney said the driveway is part of his client's deeded lot, and you are trespassing. Carol said the plat map shows otherwise, and my attorney said bring the plat map to court, because we will see you there. Carol and her witnesses left, and I went inside and tried to calm down, but my hands were shaking. My attorney said we need to escalate to the sheriff, because Carol is now engaging in direct harassment and intimidation. He said I should file a police report, and he would file a motion for a temporary restraining order, and we would use both to pressure the management company to remove Carol from the board immediately. I went to the sheriff's substation that afternoon and filed a report, and the deputy said he could not do much unless Carol physically threatened me, but the report would create a paper trail. I said that is all I need, and he gave me a case number. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week, and my attorney said we had a strong case because Carol had engaged in a pattern of harassment, retaliation, and intimidation. He said we would present the gate vendor report, the fabricated tow authorization, the fraudulent fines, the fake driveway inspection, the trespass notice, and the cropped screenshots, and the judge would see that Carol was abusing her position. I said, what if the judge does not care? And he said then we appeal, but I think the judge will care. Because this is textbook harassment. The hearing was held in the sheriff's substation lobby, because the courthouse was booked, and there was a deputy sitting at a table watching the whole thing. Carol showed up with the board president, who I guess was there for moral support, and my attorney showed up with a banker box full of evidence. The judge was a woman in her 50s who looked tired, and she said this is a civil matter, so keep it brief. My attorney presented our case in about 10 minutes, and Carol tried to interrupt twice, and the judge told her to wait her turn. When it was Carol's turn, she said I was a problem homeowner who refused to follow the rules, and everything she did was within her authority as a board member. The judge asked if she authorized the tow, and Carol said yes because the decal was tampered with. The judge asked if she had proof the decal was tampered, and Carol said she had photos. The judge said show me the photos, and Carol pulled out the same stack of printed photos with no readable text, and the judge looked at them and said these photos do not show tampering, they show a slightly crooked decal. Carol said the angle proves it was moved, and the judge said that is not how evidence works. The judge asked about the gate lockout, and Carol said it was a system malfunction, and my attorney handed the judge the vendor report. The judge read it, and she looked at Carol and said this report says you intentionally changed the configuration. Is that true? Carol said the report is incorrect, and the judge said the report has timestamps and user IDs, and it matches your email address. Carol said someone must have used her login, and the judge said, do you have evidence of that? Carol said no, but it is the only explanation, and the judge said that is not good enough. The judge asked about the trespass notice, and Carol said I violated a temporary restriction on common property. The judge asked if the restriction was based on a valid inspection, and my attorney said no, Your Honor. The inspection was based on a fabricated claim that my client resurfaced his driveway, when in fact the patch in question predates his ownership by 15 years. The judge asked Carol if she verified the age of the patch before issuing the restriction, and Carol said it is not her job to verify, it is the homeowner's job to prove compliance. The judge said that is not how enforcement works. You cannot issue a restriction based on an assumption. The judge said she was granting the restraining order, and Carol was prohibited from contacting me, entering my property, or taking any enforcement action against me without written approval from the full board. Carol said that is not fair, and the judge said this hearing is over. Carol tried to argue, and the deputy stood up and said, "Ma'am, the judge has made her ruling," and Carol left. I went home and slept for 12 hours, and when I woke up there was an email from the management company saying the compliance investigation was complete, and they found evidence of abuse of authority, retaliation, and misrepresentation of HOA procedures. The email said the management company was recommending that Carol be removed from the board, and the board president be required to undergo governance training. The email also said the HOA was required to reverse all fines issued by Carol in the past 6 months and refund any fees paid by homeowners, or the management company would terminate the contract. The board held an emergency meeting 2 days later, and I did not attend because I did not need to. The outcome was already decided. My attorney called me after the meeting and said Carol was told to step down, and she could not spin it, because the minutes recorded the reversal and the reason. He said the board voted to accept the management company recommendations, and Carol resigned effective immediately. He also said the board apologized to me in writing, and they were sending a formal letter to every homeowner explaining the changes to enforcement procedures. I got the letter 3 days later, and it included a check for $300, which was the refund of the fraudulent fines Carol issued. The letter said the board was implementing new oversight procedures, including mandatory board president approval for all fines over $100, third-party review of all enforcement actions, and quarterly audits by the management company. The letter also said the HOA was terminating its contract with the predatory tow vendor, and they were negotiating a new contract with a vendor that required written authorization from 2 board members before any tow. The final piece fell into place 2 weeks later when the city compliance office called and said they received multiple complaints about the HOA, and they were opening a review. The investigator said if the HOA did not comply with the new enforcement procedures, they would face fines and possible suspension of their covenant enforcement authority. The investigator also said the tow vendor was under investigation for accepting unauthorized tows, and they could lose their city license. Carol tried to make a comeback at the next annual meeting by running for the board again, but she lost by a landslide, and the new board president was a retired attorney who ran on a platform of transparency and accountability. I ran into Carol at the grocery store a few months later, and she pretended she did not see me, and I did the same, because I was done with that chapter of my life. The neighborhood is quieter now, and the enforcement actions are rare and reasonable, and I have not had a single problem with my permit decal or my driveway. I still work nights at the water treatment plant, and I still keep a copy of the gate vendor service report in my wallet sleeve, because it is a reminder that documentation and patience can beat even the most determined HOA tyrant. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.